Welcome to Torture Vault, where history bleeds, and the screams of the past echo through the ages. Here, we uncover the darkest punishments, brutal executions, and horrifying truths the world tried to forget. Viewer discretion is advised, because this is not just history, this is horror, carved in flesh and blood. In the shadowed courtrooms of medieval England, a specific type of crime was regarded as the most heinous of all: treason. This wasn't just any disobedience, it was betrayal against the king himself, a direct affront to divine order. For such a sin, no ordinary punishment would suffice. Thus was born a punishment so dreadful, so horrifying in its scale and detail, that it became infamous across the continent: to be hung, drawn and quartered. This execution was not a spontaneous act of barbarism but a calculated legal sentence, etched into the lawbooks under King Edward I in the late 13th century. It was designed not only to kill but to terrorize, to send a grotesque message to anyone who dared question the supremacy of the crown. While earlier monarchs dealt with traitors via beheading or simple hanging, Edward's policy toward treason ushered in a new era of state-sanctioned torture. And so, the stage was set for centuries of unparalleled cruelty. The procedure was introduced formally around 1283, during the reign of Edward I, and first used prominently against the Welsh Prince David ap Gruffydd, who dared to rebel. His fate became the prototype for this execution. He was first tied to a horse and dragged through the streets. The drawing phase, a humiliation meant to showcase the king's power and the traitor's helplessness. This wasn't just a procession. It was often a brutal ride over cobblestones, with the victim's body bouncing and scraping across the ground, bones breaking, skin tearing. This symbolic humiliation made the victim vulnerable and broken even before the real torture began. But this was just the beginning. Once at the execution site, the condemned was hanged by the neck, but not until death. No, that would be too merciful. Instead, they were cut down while still alive, gasping and convulsing. What followed next was the true descent into horror. After being hanged, the victim was disemboweled, a deliberate act of evisceration. Their abdomen was slit open, and their intestines and genitals were removed while they were still conscious. Often, these were set aflame in front of their eyes as their life ebbed away. It was a demonstration of absolute power. The king not only took your life but desecrated your body as a lesson. Then came the final act: quartering. The body, now mostly lifeless, was beheaded and chopped into 4 distinct parts. These quarters were then sent across the kingdom to be displayed in prominent locations: city gates, bridges, and marketplaces, each serving as a gory billboard that said, "This is what happens to traitors." The head was often mounted on a spike atop London Bridge or the Tower of London. And for over 500 years, this method of execution remained the crown's ultimate punishment for betrayal. To be hung, drawn and quartered was not just execution, it was psychological warfare. Every stage was a study in terror, both for the victim and the onlookers. The condemned would often spend days in prison prior to the execution, awaiting their fate. During this time, they were subjected to starvation, beatings, and mental torment. When the day arrived, they were stripped of all dignity. Sometimes dressed in a thin robe, or naked, they were tied behind a horse or cart and dragged through mud, filth, and crowds of jeering citizens. This process could take hours, depending on the route. Their skin scraped off, limbs twisted and damaged, they were presented to the execution block as a bloody, half-dead warning sign. And still, the real ordeal was just beginning. The executioner's job was as much about showmanship as cruelty. The hanging was meant to be incomplete. The goal was to render the victim weak, unconscious, perhaps, but not dead. Hanging was timed carefully. Too short, and the victim would struggle wildly. Too long, and they might die, ruining the spectacle. Executioners often took pride in their precision. Once the victim was removed from the noose, they were immediately placed on a wooden block or table, where the disembowelment began. The abdomen was sliced open with a curved blade or cleaver, and the executioner reached in with bare hands to pull out intestines, kidneys, liver, and genitals. Eyewitnesses often fainted at the smell. The internal organs were sometimes burned right then and there in a brazier placed beside the body, releasing a sickening odor of roasting flesh. This entire act was designed not just for punishment but for theater, a public event of horror that taught submission through fear. Then came the quartering, a process requiring both strength and cruelty. The beheading was swift, but not always clean. A dull axe meant multiple strikes, each severing part of the neck, splattering blood on the crowd. After the head was removed, the body was divided, sawn or chopped, into 4 pieces. This wasn't just random but symbolic. The head and quarters were seen as trophies, the spoils of royal justice. They were dipped in tar to prevent quick decomposition and mounted on spikes across the kingdom. London Bridge became notorious for its ghastly decorations, the severed heads of rebels, blackened by the sun and rotting in the rain. Children passed by these remains daily. Merchants conducted business under the dripping skulls of executed men. It wasn't just cruelty, it was policy. Every citizen, every foreigner, every noble, all were reminded of the cost of disloyalty to the crown. The list of those who faced this gruesome death reads like a who's who of rebellion. The most infamous among them was William Wallace, the Scottish knight who resisted English rule. Immortalized in Braveheart, Wallace's real fate was far more brutal than the film depicts. In 1305, after being captured, Wallace was dragged naked through London, hanged until barely alive, then eviscerated and quartered. His head was placed on London Bridge, and his limbs sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. He was not the only one. Guy Fawkes, the mastermind behind the gunpowder plot of 1605, was also sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered. But, aware of the horror that awaited, he jumped from the gallows and broke his neck, choosing suicide over agony. Nevertheless, his corpse was still quartered, and his remains distributed as a warning. Even in the 17th and 18th centuries, as other European nations moved away from such barbaric spectacles, England continued this tradition. Rebels from the Jacobite uprisings, including David Tyree in 1782, the last recorded person to be executed in this manner, were publicly dismembered. The public still gathered in droves, cheering and gasping. Pamphlets described the events in detail. Artists sketched scenes of disembowelment. It became a form of mass entertainment wrapped in legal justification. But gradually, the moral climate changed. Enlightenment thinkers criticized such brutality. Public tolerance waned. By the 19th century, the punishment was finally abolished, though the symbolic charge of high treason remained in British law until well into the 20th century. The last such sentence, though not carried out, was issued in 1946 to William Joyce, also known as Lord Ha-Ha, for broadcasting Nazi propaganda. The legacy of being hung, drawn and quartered remains one of the darkest chapters in British judicial history. Its purpose was never just to kill. It was to terrify, to render the human body into a message. And it worked. For over 5 centuries, it crushed rebellions, silenced dissent, and kept monarchs safe on their thrones. But it also scarred the soul of the nation. Today, it stands as a symbol of excessive cruelty and state violence, a reminder of how power, when left unchecked, turns justice into horror. The bones of traitors have long turned to dust, their screams lost to time, but their agony lingers in the blood-stained pages of history. And as you read this now, remember, they were once people, sons, fathers, rebels, consumed alive by a system that made death a spectacle.